They studied your movements the way a hunter studies prey. Every glance you gave, every pause you took, every word you let fall into the air became data for their restless minds. They thought obsession equaled understanding. They mistook repetition for revelation. Yet, for all their years of observation, they never cracked the code, because what they chased wasn't you. What they stalked was their projection of you, the version that existed only in their imagination. You remained untouchable because you never lived where they looked. You were fluid, shifting, evolving, refusing to be pinned to the ground like an insect under glass. They thought surveillance was power. You knew invisibility with invisibility was greater. You let them watch. You let them record. And still, they couldn't solve the riddle. They believed silence meant weakness, that your refusal to explain yourself was an admission of fear. But silence was your greatest fortress. While they wasted nights whispering theories, you were building realities that couldn't be charted. You understood the mind reveals itself most when it cannot handle quiet. So you stayed calm while their own noise betrayed them. They mistook your composure for emptiness. What they failed to realize is that still waters hold the deepest currents. They obsessed over shadows while you lived in substance. The more they pressed, the more the truth slipped from their grasp. They didn't know that the secret wasn't hiding. It was thriving right in front of them. They thought watching gave them leverage. They thought knowing your habits would give them control. Yet knowledge without understanding is useless. You changed without announcing it. You shifted while they memorized outdated versions of you. They replayed moments that no longer defined you. They clung to their notes like archaeologists, digging up a civilization that had already moved on. That is the curse of stalkers. They think persistence will grant them insight. But persistence without perception is only obsession. You were no longer the person they had been tracking. They stalked a ghost. Their problem was they wanted simplicity. They wanted you to be a pattern, a formula they could repeat and predict. But you weren't a pattern. You were the exception. You were the disruption that refused to fit into the script. Their need to box you and revealed their weakness. People who stalk are terrified of mystery. They cannot accept that some things are beyond their grasp. So they convince themselves that if they gather enough fragments, the puzzle will solve itself. But puzzles can be rigged. You gave them pieces that never belonged together, and they wasted years forcing them into a picture that didn't exist. They thought power was an exposure, that if they could uncover your secret, they could own it. But your secret was not hidden in events or facts. It was in mindset. And mindsets cannot be stalked. They cannot be photographed, recorded, or pinned down. A mindset must be lived to be understood. That is what frustrated them most. They saw your results, your resilience, your returns from storms that would have broken them. And still they could not decode the blueprint, because blueprints are worthless without the builder's hands. They saw the walls. They never found the foundation. You understood one timeless truth. Mystery is not about concealment. Mystery is about transformation. If you keep evolving, they can never map you. They wanted to measure you in chapters, but you were already writing a new book, while they were stuck rereading the old one. They stalked the character you had already killed off. You survived by molting, by shedding skins, by burning versions of yourself they were still chasing. And every time they thought they had you, you were already gone, existing in a higher form. They replayed conversations, trying to extract meaning from pauses, from half smiles, from your silence. They thought you slipped and revealed something, but you never slipped. You let them dig. You let them analyze, because you knew that overthinking is its own punishment. They turned your words into riddles, your gestures into codes, when in reality, you were simply living. They wanted the cheat sheet, the secret manual to your existence. What they didn't understand is that the code wasn't written for them. It was written for you, by you, and could only be read through the lens of experience they never had the courage to walk through. Their obsession became their weakness. The more they stalked, the more they revealed about themselves. They showed you their envy, their fear, their restlessness. You didn't need to expose them. They exposed themselves every time they failed to decipher you. They became prisoners of the chase, shackled by the very curiosity they thought gave them power. Meanwhile, you stayed free, unbothered, always 3 steps ahead. That's the irony. They thought they were hunting you. In reality, they trapped themselves in a maze of mirrors. You knew the trick all along. Let them stare, let them gather, let them imagine. Because obsession eats the one who carries it. You played for endurance, not for reaction. You didn't need to hide, you needed only to remain unbroken. Every year they wasted chasing you as another year. You grew stronger while they grew weaker. That is the cold beauty of it. You didn't fight them. You let their obsession rot them from the inside. They tried to bait you into their small games. They wanted you to argue back, to scream, to throw the same dirt they threw at you. They believed that if they could drag you into their arena, they could finally win. But you didn't move. You didn't lower yourself to prove anything. You knew that matching their tactics would give them the validation they were starving for. Instead, you let them dance in their own chaos while you stayed still. The stillness cut deeper than any response ever could. Because silence in the face of pettiness is not weakness. It is control. They hated that you didn't flinch, didn't fight, didn't break. That's the moment they realized you were playing a different game, one they could never touch. They lived for reaction. Every cheap move they made was designed to pull emotion out of you. They needed your anger, your frustration, your loss of composure, because it would prove they had power. But you didn't give it to them. You starved them of the fuel they needed to keep going. That's the difference between you and them. They lived to survive the moment. You lived to dominate the outcome. They were addicted to control they never really had, while you sat with real control in silence. The strongest retaliation was not giving them what they came for. And when they saw that their tactics bounced off you like dull knives, they began to question their own strength. You knew that stepping down to their level meant sacrificing your position. They wanted you dirty, because dirt makes people equal. They thrived on gossip, manipulation, half-truths, and theatrics. They wanted to see you sweat, wanted to see you waste time playing their games. But you understood that once you sink into their world, you've already lost. Cheap tactics are designed to distract, not to win. They're illusions of power, not the real thing. By refusing to play, you exposed them for what they were. They weren't clever. They weren't strategic. They were desperate. Every time they lashed out, you chose patience. Not because you couldn't strike, but because you knew your strike would mean more if it came from a higher ground. They wanted the quick victory. You wanted the undeniable one. That is the difference between noise and legacy. Noise is temporary. Legacy doesn't fade. So you let them fill the air with their nonsense, while you sharpened your focus. They thought your silence meant defeat. But when the time came, your presence alone was enough to make their words look empty. They played cheap because cheap was all they had. They had no depth, no discipline, no endurance. That's why they relied on dirty moves. They needed shortcuts to mask their lack of strength. You had something they never built, composure. And composure is untouchable. They can mock it, they can misunderstand it, but they can't break it. When you choose not to react, you leave them powerless. Their tricks turn into wasted energy. Their schemes collapse under their own weight. And they are left holding nothing but the silence you weaponized against them. You watched them stumble over themselves, each move more desperate than the last. They kept thinking they could provoke you into their level of chaos, but the higher you stood, the more ridiculous they looked. That's the irony of cheap tactics. They only work if you let them. If you refuse to acknowledge them, the tactics expose the user, not the target. You allowed their desperation to become their own downfall. That was the real lesson. You didn't need to fight fire with fire when you could let the flame burn them out. Life has always been filled with people who think the easiest path is the smartest one. They play small tricks, make small lies, and think they're outsmarting the world. But those tricks always unravel. Lies collapse. Cheap tactics don't build anything. They destroy the person using them. You chose the opposite. You chose the long path, the steady path, the one that doesn't always look glamorous, but always leads to dominance. That's why your victories feel permanent. They are rooted in discipline, not in deceit. Relationships taught you this most clearly. When they lied, you didn't return lies. When they played emotional games, you didn't respond with manipulation. You held your line. You stayed grounded. That's what broke them. Because when one person refuses to lower themselves, the other is forced to face their own behavior without distraction. Your refusal to mirror their tactics was the mirror itself. And mirrors always hurt those who are afraid of their reflection. You didn't need to win every battle. You needed to win the war. Cheap tactics are weapons of the impatient. They look sharp in the moment, but they rust fast. Patience, composure, and principle are weapons of the inevitable. They cut slower, but they never dull. That's why you still stand where they collapsed. You didn't waste your power on petty skirmishes. You saved it for the move that mattered. And when you made it, the entire game ended in your favor. Cheap players crave attention because attention is the only currency they have. Without eyes on them, they dissolve into nothingness. They need constant validation, applause, or even outrage to remind themselves that they matter. Their entire identity is built on being seen, not on being solid. You recognized this pattern early. You saw how they would bend themselves into shapes they couldn't hold just to get a reaction. They would spark drama, invent stories, and exaggerate victories just so anyone would look their way. But you also saw the weakness behind it. You knew that a person who needs the crowd to breathe cannot survive in solitude. So you learned to do the opposite. You learned to exist without needing anyone to clap. That made you dangerous. Because when the crowd disappeared, you were still standing while they were scrambling for air. They always dressed their emptiness with noise. If no one was paying attention, they would create reasons to be noticed. It could be lies, conflict, or fake vulnerability. It didn't matter. They needed eyes on them because in the quiet, they felt the weight of their own irrelevance. You saw that their desperation wasn't about winning or losing. It was about existing. They couldn't live without a mirror reflecting something back at them. You, however, found strength in stillness. You didn't need to prove yourself in every room you walked into. You didn't need to perform. You simply existed, and that existence carried more weight than their entire act. That was the contrast. They begged for recognition, while you were recognized without begging. They thought being loud equaled being powerful. They thought exaggerating their presence meant people would believe it. But loudness is hollow when it doesn't carry substance. You didn't have to speak over people. You let your results speak for you. While they drained themselves, keeping up appearances, you kept building something real. That's why when the noise faded, people remembered you, not them. Attention can be rented, but respect must be earned. They lived off the rent. You owned a building. Cheap players are addicts. Attention is their drug. When they don't get it, they spiral. They panic. They invent chaos because chaos guarantees that eyes turn in their direction. You saw it time and again. They couldn't sit with themselves, so they had to pull others into their storm. But you never chased the same high. You didn't need their attention. You didn't need their praise. You only needed your own conviction. That difference separated you forever. Because while they were chasing quick highs, you were building long-term strength. They burned out chasing a crowd, while you became the kind of person a crowd naturally follows. They would smile in public and collapse in private. You noticed how their entire identity cracked when no one was watching. They needed the crowd to feed them because they had no engine of their own. You, on the other hand, trained in silence.